All right, strap in everyone because today we're going deep, deep, deep into World War II German infantry tactics.
Hmm.
And we've got an incredible guide for this journey, the 1943 edition of Reibert Schützen. Have you heard of
Oh,
this?
absolutely, Reibert. It's legendary, like the Bible for German infantry.
So for our listeners who maybe haven't encountered Reibert before, can you give us a quick rundown? What exactly is this manual all about?
Well, think of it as the ultimate field manual. Everything a German soldier needed to know, from, the basics of handling a rifle to like really complex maneuvers, all packed into this one book.
So it's not just for like high-ranking officers. This was meant for every soldier on the ground.
Exactly. Boots on the ground. It was meant to be carried and used, in the trenches in the heat of battle.
That's fascinating. So in our deep dive today, we're going to be focusing on some of the key elements outlined in Reibert, with a particular focus on hand signals. The outline specifically mentions those. So what can you tell us about the role of hand signals in German infantry tactics?
Well, you gotta imagine the battlefield, right? It's chaos, it's noise. You can't just be shouting commands.
Right?
So the Germans, they developed this incredibly intricate system of hand signals. It was like a silent language of warfare.
Oh, wow. So like almost like a secret code.
In a way, yeah. Each movement, each gesture meant something specific. It could be anything from enemy sighted to advance to take cover, critical information conveyed silently in the heat of battle.
That's incredible. Can you maybe give us a specific example of one of these hand signals and how it was used?
Sure. One that really stands out is the signal for enemy sighted. So picture this: a squad leader, right arm extended forward, index finger pointing straight out, just like that.
Mm-hmm.
That simple gesture instantly alerted the entire unit to the presence of the enemy, allowed them to react swiftly and silently.
I can just imagine the tension in that moment. You see your squad leader make that signal, and you know things are about to get real.
Exactly. It was all about speed, efficiency, and maintaining the element of surprise.
So Reaper really went in depth on these hand signals. Did it specifically address any like advantages or maybe even limitations of relying on them?
Absolutely. The manual, it stresses, the importance of clear, concise signals, like lives depended on their proper execution, but it also acknowledges that there were limitations, like at night, for example, or in dense terrain where visibility was poor. Hand signals, they weren't always the most reliable.
That makes sense. It seems like a system that would require a ton of training and discipline to really master.
Oh, absolutely. It was all about ingrained reflexes, instant understanding, unwavering trust between comrades. I mean, you had to know these signals like the back of your hand, literally.
Wow. So it wasn't just about knowing the moves, it was about a whole mindset, a level of trust and cohesion within the unit.
Right.
That's fascinating. Now, we've talked about hand signals, but the outline also mentions camouflage. Was Reibert as detailed when it came to the art of blending in?
Absolutely. Reibert goes deep on camouflage and concealment. I mean,
Wow.
this was not just about like throwing on a ghillie suit. It was about understanding the terrain, adapting to different environments, essentially becoming invisible to the enemy.
So it was more than just like slapping some branches on your helmet. It was a whole philosophy of like disappearing into the environment.
Exactly. And Reibert makes it very clear that mastering camouflage was just as crucial as knowing how to handle a weapon. It was all about maximizing your advantages, minimizing your exposure, and always being a step ahead.
So kind of like playing a constant game of hide and seek with the enemy, but with much higher stakes.
Absolutely. And Reibert didn't just talk about the general concept, it actually provided really specific techniques for using camouflage in different combat situations. Like there were instructions for building camouflaged positions, using shadows and natural cover, even how to camouflage vehicles and equipment.
Wow, so it was like a comprehensive guide to the art of invisibility?
It really was.
Now I'm curious, did Rebert address the limitations of camouflage? Like, were there situations where it might not be as effective?
Of course. Reibert acknowledges that, camouflage isn't foolproof. Things like weather,
Mm-hmm.
terrain, enemy observation capabilities, all these things could impact its effectiveness. The manual, it stresses the importance of adapting your techniques to each specific situation. What works in a forest might not work in a desert.
So even the art of blending in required constant adaptation and awareness.
Precisely.
Fascinating. All right, so we've talked about staying hidden, communicating silently, but what about moving on the battlefield? I imagine Reybert had something to say about how soldiers should move under fire.
Oh, definitely. The manual, it puts a huge emphasis on tactical movement, like using cover and concealment. moving quickly and silently, and maintaining proper spacing between soldiers to minimize casualties.
So it wasn't just about running and gunning. Every movement was calculated.
Exactly, and Reibert outlined various movement patterns and formations designed for different combat scenarios. It stressed the importance of fluidity, adapting to the terrain, and always maintaining situational awareness.
It really makes you realize that every action on the battlefield, even how you move, was strategically planned.
Absolutely. And it all ties back to the concept of minimizing your exposure, maximizing your effectiveness.
Now, before we go any further, I'm really curious about those movement patterns and formations you mentioned. Can you give us a specific example of how Reibert instructed soldiers to move in a combat situation?
Okay, so one classic example is the fire and maneuver tactic. Reibert describes how one part of a squad would provide covering fire, suppressing the enemy, while another element would use that cover to advance and outflank the enemy position.
That sounds incredibly coordinated. How would they communicate and coordinate those movements in the heat of battle?
Well, that's where those hand signals we talked about earlier come in. Remember, Reibert really emphasizes how hand signals would be used to direct movements, indicate targets, maintain communication, all without alerting the enemy.
So it was like conducting an orchestra, but with weapons and under enemy fire.
Pretty much. It was all about silent, efficient coordination.
It's amazing how all these elements, camouflage, movement, hand signals, were interwoven to create this comprehensive system of infantry tactics.
It was a very sophisticated approach, for sure.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious about one more thing. Reconnaissance. The outline mentioned that. How did Reibert approach the importance of scouting, gathering information on the enemy?
Reibert considered reconnaissance absolutely vital. I mean, it was the key to gaining a tactical advantage, and it dedicated entire sections to the art of patrolling, observing enemy positions, and interpreting, signs of enemy activity.
So it wasn't just about brute force, it was about knowing your enemy, knowing the terrain, almost like playing a game of chess, trying to anticipate their moves.
Exactly. And Reibert provided really detailed instructions on how to conduct patrols, establish observation posts, how to interpret things like tracks, discarded equipment, other signs of enemy presence.
It sounds like Reibert was equipping soldiers to be more than just fighters. They were becoming tactical thinkers, skilled observers.
Exactly. And that's a key takeaway here.
Wow. This has been an incredible start to our deep dive. I'm already seeing how Reibert wasn't just a set of rules, but a whole philosophy of warfare, a way of thinking that shaped the actions of German soldiers on the battlefield.
Absolutely. And we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to uncover.
Well, I think we need a moment to process all of this amazing information before we dive any deeper.
Agreed. It's amazing how a manual from 1943 can still be so relevant today. Like we were just talking about reconnaissance and information gathering, and those are still absolutely fundamental in modern warfare.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. It makes you wonder what else from Reibert has kind of echoed through time. Are there other things that influenced how militaries think about things today?
Oh, absolutely. One big one that jumps out is this concept of Auftragstaktik, which it roughly translates to mission-type tactics.
Okay, Auftragstaktik, that's a mouthful. What exactly does that mean? Break it down for us.
Well, it's all about empowering the guys lower down the chain, lower level commanders and even individual soldiers, giving them the ability to make decisions in the field based on the overall mission.
So it's not just blindly following orders from the top.
Right, exactly. It's about being flexible, being adaptable. And that was really a hallmark of German infantry tactics, and it's all over Reibert.
It seems like a pretty big departure from how we traditionally think of the military, with its strict hierarchy and all that.
Yeah, it was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time. And Reibert actually gives specific examples and guidelines for how to apply this Auftragstaktik in combat.
Really? Like what?
Well, it lays out all these tactical scenarios, almost like case studies, that show how soldiers could use their own judgment to solve problems and overcome challenges.
So they're encouraged to think on their feet, basically.
Exactly. It was about understanding the commander's intent. Yeah, but also assessing the situation on the ground and making decisions that actually made sense, even if it meant deviating from the original plan.
That must have required a crazy amount of trust between the officers and their men.
Oh, absolutely. And Reibert talks about this too. It stresses how important clear communication is, making sure everyone understands the mission, and having really thorough training so everyone can operate within this kind of decentralized system.
So it's like trust but verify. Right.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about blindly trusting your subordinates, it's about equipping them with the skills and knowledge they need to make the right decisions.
So how effective was this off-track tactic in actual combat? Did it actually give the Germans an edge?
I mean, there's no question that it played a part in their early successes in World War II. It allowed them to be super responsive, seize opportunities and outmaneuver their opponents who were stuck in more rigid command structures.
But I'm guessing there were also some downsides.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Reibert acknowledges that too. It's not a magic bullet. It only works if you have highly trained and motivated soldiers, solid communication, and everyone really understands the mission. If any of those pieces are missing, it can lead to confusion, mistakes, and, ultimately failure.
So even a system that's built on flexibility and adaptability needs a strong foundation.
Exactly. You can't just throw guys out there and expect them to figure it out on their own. They need the training, the discipline, and the leadership to make it work.
So bringing it back to today, has Auftrag's tactic influenced modern military thinking? Is it still a thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The principles of off-track tactic are still super relevant. A lot of countries, especially those that focus on adaptability and taking initiative, they've incorporated these ideas into their doctrine.
So the way we fight wars today, even with all the technology and stuff, it's still influenced by these ideas from back in World War II.
I mean, the tools have obviously evolved, but that core idea of giving individuals the power to make decisions within a clear framework, it's still a super valuable concept.
That's incredible. So we've gone from hand signals to this high-level concept of off-track tactic. It's amazing how much is packed into Reibert. But before we go too far down the rabbit hole of military theory, let's get back to some of the more practical stuff. We talked about how important weapons handling is, and I'm sure Reibert had a lot to say about that, right?
Oh, definitely. I mean, Reibert is super detailed when it comes to marksmanship, weapons maintenance, and how to actually use all these different infantry weapons effectively.
So like a soldier's toolbox, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. It covers everything from the basics of rifle shooting to how to use machine guns, mortars, anti-tank weapons, you name it. They wanted to make sure soldiers were proficient with all the tools of the trade.
That's really interesting. Can you give us an example, like maybe how Reibert approached training on the standard German rifle?
Sure, so the standard rifle back then was the Carabiner 98K, and Reibert has entire sections on how to operate it, clean it, maintain it. It really drilled down to the fundamentals, sight alignment, trigger control, breathing techniques, all that stuff. And then it also had tactical drills and exercises to help soldiers practice their shooting in different combat scenarios.
So it wasn't just about knowing how to shoot. It was about knowing how to shoot in the chaos of battle.
Exactly. You could be the best marksman on the range, but if you can't handle the pressure of combat, it doesn't really matter.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
Now, I'm wondering, did Reibert also address the mental side of combat? The stress, the fear, all that stuff. How did it prepare soldiers for that?
That's a great question. I mean, Reibert is mostly focused on the practical and tactical stuff, but it definitely acknowledges that mental preparedness is important too. It talks about the need for courage, determination, and being able to stay calm and focused under fire.
So it wasn't just about being physically tough, it was about being mentally tough, too.
Exactly. You had to have that warrior mindset.
Did Reibert have any specific advice on how to develop that mental toughness?
Well, it doesn't get too deep into psychology or anything, but it really emphasizes discipline, unit cohesion, and trusting your comrades. That sense of brotherhood, of shared sacrifice, it was a big part of what helped them get through the horrors of war.
So building that camaraderie, that was as important as any weapon or tactic.
I think so, yeah.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on something we haven't talked about much yet.
Yeah.
Logistics. The practical stuff of keeping soldiers supplied and equipped in the field. Did Reibert cover that at all?
Yeah, it did. It wasn't a huge focus of the manual, but it definitely acknowledged how important logistics are. It had sections on basic field craft, like how to pack your gear, how to maintain your equipment, how to find food and water, how to improvise when things go wrong.
So being resourceful, thinking on your feet, that was part of the Reibert philosophy too.
Definitely. It recognized that in war, things don't always go according to plan. You have to be able to adapt to make do with what you have.
That's really interesting. It makes you appreciate just how comprehensive Reibert was,
Right.
how it tried to prepare soldiers for every aspect of combat.
Yeah, they really tried to cover all the bases.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about everything from hand signals to Auftragstaktik to weapons handling and even logistics. It's incredible how much insight this one manual offers into the world of World War II German infantry. But we're running out of time, so we're going to have to take a break and come back for the final leg of our journey. Okay, we're back for the final stretch of our Reibert deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from hand signals to camouflage to Auftragstaktik and everything in between. It's really remarkable how much we've learned about German infantry tactics from just this one manual.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey. And I think what really stands out for me is how Reibert emphasizes this kind of holistic approach to warfare. It's not just about fighting, it's about thinking, adapting, and really outsmarting your opponent.
Right, like we talked about reconnaissance and gathering information, Reibert clearly saw knowledge as a weapon in itself. But it also went beyond that, instilling a sense of discipline, resourcefulness, and even a certain level of respect for the enemy.
Absolutely. And that's something that really struck me too. The manual repeatedly talks about following the rules of war, treating prisoners humanely. It really stresses that soldiers should fight with honor and restraint, even in the most difficult situations.
It's kind of surprising, actually. We don't often think about that side of war, the rules and codes of conduct. It's easy to forget that even in the midst of all the chaos and violence, there were attempts to maintain some sort of order.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the level of professionalism that Reibert was trying to instill in German soldiers. It wasn't just about winning at all costs, it was about fighting with a sense of purpose, a higher standard.
It makes you wonder how those ideals actually played out in the real world, especially as the war went on and things got even more brutal.
That's a really complex question,
Right.
and it's important to remember the historical context. While Reibert promoted this code of conduct, the reality on the battlefield was often very different. The pressures of war, the propaganda, the atrocities that happened on both sides, all of that undoubtedly influenced the actions of soldiers.
It's a good reminder that even the most comprehensive manual can't account for the human element, for the unpredictable nature of war.
Exactly. You can have all the training and preparation in the world, but ultimately it comes down to individual choices and how people react under pressure.
But despite all those complexities, Reibert still gives us this really valuable window into the mindset of German soldiers during World War II. It helps us understand how they were trained, how they thought about combat, and what they were fighting for.
And it also raises these really interesting questions about the evolution of warfare, the role of technology, the enduring relevance of certain tactical principles, like we saw with Auftragstaktik. These ideas from back then are still shaping how militaries operate today.
And it makes you wonder, how will these principles continue to evolve as we face new challenges in the future? What do you think?
It's hard to say for sure. The battlefield of the future is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen. Technology is changing everything so rapidly. But I think one thing is certain: the human element will always be a factor. The need for courage, for leadership, for the ability to adapt and think critically, those things will never go away.
So even though the tools and the tactics might change, the essence of warfare, that human element at its core, will always be there. That's a pretty profound thought.
It is. And it's something that Reibert reminds us of. Even though it's a document from a specific time and place, it speaks to these universal truths about conflict and the human condition.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Reibert Schützen. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope it's given our listeners a new appreciation for the complexities of warfare and the enduring relevance of these historical documents. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next deep dive.